It is an absolute pleasure to invite everybody to another telecast of Women's Health Weekly, brought to you by the experts in New York City and around the country, representing Maiden Lane Medical, and many of our guests who have private practices and work for public health institutions and are all involved to some degree in women's health care. And as I've said on every single telecast, we are thrilled to bring you expert information. Our goal is for you to be able to get expert information from us and not have to go out into the Google sphere and get that information from sources which may not be optimal. Also, as our frequent guests have already heard from me, we have a very exciting development, which is that we have now put all of our telecasts out onto podcasts so you can listen to the complete broadcast of the audio as you go on the train. Although I don't know that that many people are taking public transportation these days. I think everybody's hunkered down and either driving or working from home. I think that's what's going on in most of the country. But I want to let everybody know that the podcast is available on Apple, on Spotify, and wherever else you may catch your favorite podcast. So I think that line is from iHeartRadio, and that's the one place where you can't find us. So I'd like to welcome to our Women's Health Weekly broadcast this week Dr. Daniel Hochman, who is in now Austin, Texas. Correct, Dr. Hochman?
Yeah, that's right.
That's so cool. Austin is like the coolest spot in Texas now, I guess. And I have all sorts of fun things to ask you about Austin, Texas. But what I really want to talk about today is your expertise, and I want to pick your brain, and I want to let our YouTube viewers pick your brain and ask you all sorts of fantastic questions about addiction and compulsions and other things that they may be involved in that may take away from the quality of their life. Dr. Hochman is a board certified psychiatrist. He is an expert in addiction. He runs a fantastic in person and online recovery and treatment program. And we're really excited to have him here. So, welcome to Women's Health Weekly, Dr. Hochman. And how are you today?
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, Ken, and glad to be on and excited to have a discussion here.
Excellent. We're really looking forward to it. So let's
Yeah.
jump on in. And I also want to add that, as I do at the beginning of every telecast, that we have no commercial interest in any one particular product. We will certainly talk about Dr. Hoffman's practice and how you can access that practice, but I personally have no commercial interest or financial interest in any products or any other money making schemes that we might discuss at any point in any telecast on Women's Health Weekly. So, great. We're going to talk about addiction. We're going to talk about addiction in terms of women's health. And we're going to bring that topic back to women's health at every turn. And we really want to ask you what on earth, what is addiction? You're a psychiatrist, so
Mm.
you must know what addiction is. And so I really want to hear it from your mouth.
Sure. So it's a very loaded term. Um, Addiction has clinical meaning, but addiction also is, of course, a word we just use colloquially. So we say we're addicted to all sorts of things, and sometimes we really, really mean it, and sometimes we're just saying that to make a point. They're all fine uses of the word, but of course, when we say it in our own heads, we have to be careful about what we really mean, and that who we're talking to understands what we mean. So it's the same thing, psychiatrically we say, I'm going crazy or I'm schizophrenic or all these different things. So I never have a problem with people using words how they want, but we just have to be careful we know what we're trying to say. So addiction clinically has significance because, it's got a lot of detrimental effects. So being addicted to alcohol or any kind of drug obviously just, is terribly hard on the body and has implications of, it's usually leads to all kinds of things declining. It's all the medical risk, but it's a decline in your family life, in your finances, in your work, in your friendships, sort of everything. So clinically, addiction means that you're getting stuck on a substance, needing to use more and more to reach the same effect. And that, when you get there, well, the other side's hard too. You can't really get off because you've become habituated to it. So that's the physiologic or sort of physical dependent side, is that you get stuck on something and you have a hard time getting off. The other part of it is that there's always a psychological dependence. And pretty much every time you're talking about a true physical addiction, you also have the psychological reliance. So if you're addicted to alcohol, let's say, part of it is hard because you drink more and more and then you can't get off because you're used to drinking more. And if you stop, you'll go into withdrawal. And so the easier thing is just keep drinking or keep your use up so that you don't have to enter that painful state of withdrawal. But also think about separately, every time you're getting physically dependent on something, it becomes psychologically reliant as well. So imagine drinking and your body gets physically reliant on it, fine, but you're also becoming psychologically reliant. So you've now grown accustomed, let's say, to drinking anytime you're going to be meeting new people or out, socializing or dealing with, a rough day at work and coming home. Well, now, on top of the physical part, you're now psychologically expecting that, to get through a scary, anxious, sad, tough time, now I've got to use this thing to get by. And over time, we become scared that if we don't have it, we're going to fall apart, or we don't know, what's going to happen, and we're going to become overwhelmed.
So that is a lot to unpack, and I really want to get into that. Now, so you said something at the beginning of discussing this topic that we use the term colloquially quite frequently. Um, so we said people say all the time, "Oh, I'm addicted to this show," or I'm addicted to this person. She's great.
Yeah.
I'm addicted to. I have to get that ice cream. I'm totally addicted to it. Is that just the complete
Right.
use of the? Is that just the complete incorrect use of the term addiction?
I think it's fine. The irony is I think that people who use it that way are actually sometimes more accurate than, hardcore scientists saying, no, no, that's not addiction. It can't be addicted to Netflix. It's not a chemical. I can't show you in the MRI all this stuff happening. The truth is when we say we're addicted to Netflix or a person, those are behaviors, right? So there's not substances, they're behaviors and relationships to things. We can absolutely become addicted in those ways, and there's data to back that up. So when we put people through functional MRIs, so looking at sort of brain waves and action, and how fast the brain is working in certain areas of the brain, we do see very similar patterns when we're talking about being addicted to people, being addicted to shows, especially sugar. So, for example, sugar produces a higher dopamine rush than cocaine. So we say, well, I'm addicted to these chips or, whatever, dessert you like or ice cream, like you said. Those are addictive. Those produce a biochemical response. Now, do we go into withdrawal? Not really. I mean, yeah, there's maybe a crash after the sugar rush, but that's not,
Hold it.
remotely
So
related.
hold it 1 second. That was that. Hold on. You've just laid so much cool stuff on the table. I really want to go for it,
Right.
and I don't
Let's
want
do
to
it.
lose that conversation about alcohol that you kind of brought up earlier in creating an example. But sugar creates like an immediate, just as high, if not higher, dopamine rush than cocaine.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Really
we've quantified these things. Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so it's no wonder the sugar addiction is a real addiction. It's powerful.
Oh yeah. I mean, some things taste great, right? They're and our body needs to have a mechanism to know what it needs to go after. We're animals. We're all dressed up and we get educated and we think we're so different. We're animals. We're just beasts. And
I
in the
love it.
animal world, you need a way to know what to go after, and it needs to feel really good and pleasurable pretty darn quickly so that we pair that association so that we say, I like that. So we absolutely get that with food. We get it with people. So we get it with sex. We get it with very beautiful things. So we are animals who are very inclined, we need feedback from our natural world to know what we need to get more of. And it usually comes down to, security, procreation, stuff like that, all the fun stuff. So, food and money
So
And
arguably, there's a survival benefit to addiction. But when it,
yeah, so
I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, perhaps our brains are wired for addiction to some degree, because there may be a survival benefit to knowing what the difference between something we enjoy and something that's not good for us or that we don't enjoy. And maybe I shouldn't put those two things together. Not good for us and don't enjoy aren't the same. Aren't necessarily the same thing.
well, there's the trick, right? Is that you're absolutely right. You're actually being conservative in saying, that we have some of this mechanism. We all have the so-called addiction circuit entirely in us, from birth, and it remains, and it does have an evolutionary advantage. It is the basis of just, brain body function, is to understand what we want to get more of that's for survival. So any animal needs to have this set up and functioning well in order to survive. If you don't feel good when you're eating or seeking shelter, for humans, shelter often is paired with money. So money is what makes us feel like we're going to be safe and be okay, and procreate, right? So we like sex. Those things are absolutely an evolutionary, not just advantage, it's a necessity. If you don't have those, you're done as an individual or a population. So,
Sure, right. If
uh,
you can't tell what's good and edible, and you can't procreate, then your species is done.
yeah, absolutely done. So we're talking in the natural world that works properly when we're humans and we've evolved and we've got all these advances that we have to get, you know, anything available. And that can range from, plentiful food and sugar to pornography to Netflix. Now you can do so much so easily that, now we've got this issue of, can you moderate what was naturally extremely helpful? So, so that's the kicker, right? Is, can we learn to modify that relationship for our long-term survival, individually or as a population?
So
So
our animal survival, if I'm reading this right, our animal survival doesn't quite jibe with our modern societal norms. In other words, our
wow,
yeah,
it's
it's a
dangerous,
problem.
right?
And then those come out as behaviors and activities that are not accepted in society and may even be and thus may even be harmful to someone's functioning in normal society, and thus we call them addictions because they're damaging to someone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everything you become addicted to has origins in something that's healthy, would be one way to, put that, which is,
Interesting.
it's very healthy to want to court someone and then, have sex. That's healthy. Well, pornography and getting carried away with all that, and, having to have sex multiple times a day and everything, well, that gets carried away. We could say the same thing about anything, right? So food, we need food, very healthy origins, but, you know, too much, too often, unmoderated, well, that'll kill you. So,
Sure. Same
you
thing
know,
probably with drugs. You usually reference the cocaine reference, and the drugs themselves are bad, but the dopamine rush associated with them is probably very good for survival out on the plains 10,000 years ago.
yeah, yeah. I mean, dopamine has benefits. It's what stimulants cause release of, right? It helps us concentrate, even. Let alone like a rush. There's a lot of benefits to all these things, all the endorphins. They make us feel good. Components of these things actually help, prevent damage in our body, because when we feel good, so whether that's sex, a healthy meal, love, when we get things that feel pleasurable, um, that is part of what maintains our health, and our body works better that way. But yeah, it's when it's too much, and then the whole cascade happens, and you tip the balance physically, but also psychologically, because you start chasing, things that aren't very good for your life, and take you away from other healthy things.
All right, I'd love to go back to the alcohol example. in kind of segueing to the next topic. Just once again, welcome back to Maiden Lane Medical Women's Health Weekly. We're here with Dr. Daniel Hochman, who is a psychiatrist in Austin, Texas, and is an expert in addiction, treatment, living a healthy lifestyle, and making positive changes in a holistic way that will last forever. So you mentioned alcohol, and we're all dealing with something that no one's ever really had to deal with before in modern times, which is kind of being stuck at home and maybe a little bit bored, maybe certainly a whole lot anxious. And alcohol's a soother for many people in that situation. So I imagine there's a fine line between drinking at home for, is it, maybe I'll use the wrong, for pleasure, or for decreasing some of that anxiety, or even just socially with your spouse, as you might potentially normally have a glass of wine or two with dinner. But then at some point, I guess it goes overboard. So I kind of laid that out and sort of hopefully set the framework. But I want to ask the question specifically: are women more susceptible? Women in general, are women in general more susceptible to, and kind of, yeah, I guess we kind of break that into two categories: the sort of substance abuse addictions, and then the non-substance abuse addictions or compulsions. What's the difference there, and are women more susceptible to that, to those problems?
Yeah, well, the good news for women is women do have lower rates of addiction kind of across the board, no matter the substance, including alcohol. Women tend to have lower rates of addiction. There can be some question around the validity of surveys that you get, because, if men are a little more sort of proud of their drinking or something and women aren't, you might not have completely accurate data. But for the most part, we do know men have addiction at higher rates. That gap has been closing for alcohol. So it has become much more, for better or worse, as times become more equitable for men and women. Women are having an easier time drinking and talking about their drinking, and having book clubs where they drink and all that. So so in some ways we've advanced as a society where it's not just men who go out and drink with their buddies, but along with that, over the last couple decades, we've narrowed the gap. So women drink nearly on par with men. Younger women, like high school age, actually are now having higher rates of drinking than men. And the number right now is around 1 in 6 women struggles with drinking, like binge drinks. So it's extremely common in women. So alcohol has become more similar. Drugs, that has still not caught up, and hopefully goes down in absolute numbers for everybody. But yeah, alcohol, since it's become a little bit more socially acceptable for women to drink, that's been a bad thing in some ways.
I imagine there are social trends all around the susceptibility of various populations for addiction in general. Right, if it's become more socially acceptable for women to go out and binge drink, we certainly hear about that at the college level, but I imagine that has the potential to translate into adulthood. One of the sort of societal changes that has come to the fore in recent years is women in the workplace, and women having more senior management and executive positions, and those jobs may typically be associated in and of themselves with more drinking, more entertaining clients, more getting out there with spending more time with men who may be drinking heavily, and they may feel a pressure at work to keep up. So that's an interesting trend that we're seeing, and I wonder how it'll play out. And I wonder what type of services and what type of help women are getting, which kind of brings me to the question: um, who's talking about it? Who's talking about addiction? Are women coming? I mean, so I'm a gynecologist, as you know, and I don't. We do at the beginning of every visit, we do an alcohol screening test. We certainly ask people if they're using any drugs, although my guess is only 10% of them or so actually admit to that. But the question is, who's bringing this topic up? Are women talking about addictive behaviors at their primary care visits? they're certainly not showing up at a psychiatrist and just saying, "Hey, I'm addicted to X." They usually get to the
Right.
psychiatrist, as you mentioned earlier, when there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'd be curious to hear more about how the encounters go for you in the office, because women, I think we've progressed as far as women, more in the workplace and dealing with things that men have historically, dealt with only. But yeah, I mean, this first, just to back up, I mean, the strain on women is so great now because there is an expectation to be both now sort of a career woman and still be mom. And women hold this, notion and sort of ideal in their mind of wanting to be kind of what they imagined growing up as like this amazing mom. But this new societal shift of women, still having, full-time work, leadership roles, and all that. So it's an impossible task. And what happens when any population, deals with an impossible task? Something's got to give. And addiction is part of that picture. When things give, that's the buffer, right? You've had a terribly long day or not enough time to process something, just life challenges. And what happens? Well, it's not necessarily that you drink. It could be drink that you drink. Could be harder drugs. Could be that you overeat. But there's going to be some process there as the give.
So while
Because
we're,
yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead. I interrupted you.
you can say go exercise, go for walks and things, but those only go so far for people that are put through enough challenge. You can, when you're disciplined at work and you're disciplined at home, and then someone's saying, well, to treat that stress, go do something else disciplined and go work out, let's say. It doesn't really provide this release valve. And that's what I see, is people need that still. And that's a reality. A lot of people, when you say, what are people talking about? Nobody talks about that. That what do you do as a person when you still have no release? You have no way to buffer life's challenges.
So we're getting some really great questions, and we love to get questions from our YouTube viewers. Certainly, if you have a question, feel free to type it in, and we'll get right to it. And while we sort of touched on the topic of gender differences in rates of addiction to various substances, and don't forget, I really want to get back to this topic of non-substance sort of, and I'm gonna shoot myself for using air quotes, but here we go, air quotes, non-substance type of addictions or behaviors. But
Yeah.
while we're talking about a gender difference, I don't want to let this question go, which is how do genetics play a role in addiction? Some people in the same family potentially get like a whole family has real substance abuse issues, and then another family, they might, be exposed to the same substances and never wind up with an actual, physiologic addiction. How does that
Right.
work out?
Okay, so really interesting stuff. So if I just tell you a textbook answer, it's going to say 50% is genetic, 50% is environmental, like how you're raised, what your life is, and all that. Um, that's rubbish, frankly. So the reason I can go on about the data we have, but to summarize, the reason I claim that that's rubbish is um, when people's lives improve and there's less strain in their life, addiction leaves. It goes away. So that's one thing. We do have wonderful studies of twins. Okay, so identical twins, and
Whose genetics are exactly the same, just for everybody out there. Identical twins gonna have the same genes.
yeah, so same exact genes. And if one of those identical twins has an addiction, the odds are still that the other identical twin will not. Is it a
Ah,
higher rate? Yes, yes, it is a higher rate, but it's just to make the point, your even identical twin doesn't necessarily predict that you're going to have addiction. The truth is, addiction is really passed on more so in how you're raised and the environment and how critical your environment was and the sorts of things you had to deal with in your family. So if you've got a mom who drinks or a dad who drank and beat you, well, yeah, you're at a much higher rate of addiction as you grow up. But that's not because of the genetics. That's because of how you were treated. We also see, we've studied this really well cleanly in primates, where you stack all these so-called addiction genes, and there's several. You can manipulate these and stack to select for the primates to be born with all of the addiction genes, and those had very little effect on whether those grew up to be addicted. What was the most predictive of all, when we study these things cleanly, is how that child is raised. So in that primate study, a primate who was well nurtured and cared for, meaning in that sense, usually held and given warmth, literally, held and stroked and nice maternal love, they don't get addiction. On the other hand, you stack you put a primate with zero genetic sort of predisposition to addiction, and you withhold that warmth and love, they all get addiction. So, and I could go on about human studies, rat studies. The studies all point in this direction.
So back to the point that we're all wired for addiction, but if you lose that environmental exposure that makes you susceptible, then you're not going to wind up with an addiction issue potentially. I mean, or your risk. I shouldn't say it's absolute, because nothing's absolute in this, but your risk certainly becomes significantly lower if you're not exposed to an adverse environmental scenario throughout at least the early part, if not the formative years of your life, where that might potentially create an addiction. That's very interesting, and I think having genetically identical research subjects is probably the most telling way to get that data, to make that data real, to make it obvious. All right, so so we've got some great. Dr. Hochman's giving us some amazing science on this, because I don't think a lot of people are aware of these issues around addiction. All right, let's talk about the diagnosis or the self-diagnosis. What should make me feel like I might potentially have an addiction problem, or a problem with addiction, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or I want to say, and we'll get to defining this, I want to say that sort of the non-substance abuse type of addictions, my phone, the video games, you name it.
Yeah, I mean, I would put that pretty simply, which is just, I would consider yourself, I would consider that the object of what you feel like you're addicted to is a problem when it's a problem. So, I don't think people need to overcomplicate it. I mean, yes, if you're, shooting up heroin multiple times a day and you've lost sort of all the close people in your life, okay, that's a slam dunk. Sure, you're addicted. But yeah, I mean, what is it when you feel like you're addicted to food or your phone or Netflix or porn? Well, pretty much just when it's a problem. Now, diagnostically, you've got to meet more than just like one problem. So if you've just lost one friend or one relationship or one job or something, that's not going to classically be defined as addiction, and you're not going to have that diagnosis. But what do you care about diagnosis? There's no medication, to help with, phone addiction anyway. So, you have to ask, well, why am I even trying to define this? Well, if you're trying to define it because you want to know if you have something you need to do something about, I would keep it very simple and say, if you see it producing problems in your life, well, then who cares what it's called? Do something about it. And so if you're on the phone, way too much, scrolling, throughout the whole day, and you don't pick your head up and look at your partner over dinner, then that's a problem. It's not that's not going to be defined as an addiction. That's not going to meet clinical criteria. But if
don't wait until the divorce.
That's a problem.
Don't wait until the divorce papers arrive.
Right.
Say, hey, this is a problem here.
But it can be bad still.
Yeah. Okay, so practically there are all these other. So you're right. So I guess somebody may not want to admit it or realize it, that they're having a substance abuse problem, because there's a lot of social issues around that, and they may not even want to get help, and there may be people around them supporting it or coddling it, and the fact that they lost their job during COVID-19 may not be an issue for them, even though, like, the other 80 people in their office didn't lose their job.
Yeah.
That was just an excuse to get rid of you because they don't like you for some reason, and it may be because you show up to work drunk. So those are pretty obvious addiction stories, the drugs and alcohol. But what practically? So you mentioned, yeah, I don't really need a diagnosis to call myself potentially addicted or addicted to something that's not necessarily a substance. Practically speaking, what are the things that I can do to help at change and improve my life around those non-substance issues?
It's always going to have to do with going back to the roots. So um, I think it's helpful to kind of separate out a couple things. So one is sort of when we innocently fall into certain habits and compulsions, and other times when it has a little more story and background to it. So an example of what I mean by innocence is social media kind of gets us all. We get bombarded with stuff. It's clickbait. It's easy. It's convenient. It's right there, and it's usually going to be more fun to to do what's right in front of you that's fun than work or do go for run or do anything that's difficult at all or discipline. So that's sort of the innocent stuff. That's a little separate than most people who suffer from what they really would call, more clinical addiction with, real drinking, drugs, where that's not just innocent. Usually that's coming out of real pain. So um, for most people who are considering themselves addicted in the real medical sense, I would absolutely recommend following where someone's pain is. And pain can mean clinical depression, clinical and anxiety disorder. It can mean all sorts of things like PTSD, but pain can be anything emotional. So pain can be very commonly bored with life, feeling empty, feeling like I thought I was going to be somewhere different in life, or my life partner doesn't quite satisfy me. So just not being where you want in life is one of the more common reasons that people go on to have a true addiction with a substance or alcohol. And and so that is where I would always point people. Whether you do therapy, take a medication for that, or do something else personal, that's those are details. But the big picture is you take care of the source of your pain, and that true addiction will fade away.
How does somebody get to that? How does someone figure out what their pain is? Is that
Some
what guys?
people never.
Is that why we have psychiatrists? Is
Yeah,
that to help out with that?
yeah. That can be a difficult art, and sometimes people know it full well. So people will come in. I see some patients who have been through years of therapy and they've missed the mark. Um, they get sometimes thrown off by a couple other things they thought were bothering them, but you can really tell when they're sitting there with you that other people have missed the mark before, and that's not really where their pain is. Because just because you went through something difficult doesn't mean it's emotionally a burden for you for the rest of your life. And then I see other times the opposite. People know exactly what it is. They come in, they're emotionally attuned, or it's just so blatantly obvious to them. They know just what it is. But in either case, whether it takes a long time to understand where your pain is, or you already know, in either case, I see more difficulty with people trying to figure out, well, what do I do about that? So let's say you've been abused as a child, or let's say you just, can't keep a job, or you keep getting left, your partners keep leaving you. Um, Even if you know what it is, well, still, I see a lot of people that come in and they're trying different methods, beforehand that generally just don't work. So an example of that would be, say you've been abused as a child, and you say, well, what do I do about that? I've already been abused. What good is talking about it going to do, or what's a medication going to do? It can't change my past. I have this bad burden, and it bothers me still. Um, and that's where people struggle is, what do you actually do about it? What does that mean? What does it look like to do something about, PTSD or depression? And that's where there's actually a very, very terrible lack of good guidance, from therapy or doctors even. Most people don't know how to take someone through that journey, and and if we had more of that, I think we would see that there'd be far, far lower rates of addiction if people are actually more emotionally well and had good guidance on how to deal with very regular cases of depression, anxiety, and not being happy with life.
So I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that moment to share with our YouTube viewers that Dr. Hochman has a way to help you. He didn't ask me to promote this. I am doing this because I believe in what he has and the message he gives. He has a. You can go to Dr. Hochman's website called selfrecovery.org, and we can you can use that connection there to reach Dr. Hochman, and he can offer you solutions to whatever you have going on. I doubt it's free, so that
Yeah.
but there's a way. There's help out there for people who struggle with the everyday um, addictions. And again, so I want to go back to this. And we went off this topic. What's the difference between these? I like to say that we've alluded to a number of times, these everyday addictions, these
Uh-huh.
behaviors that are unhelpful, and a real addiction. And what are the things that you do with patients that come to you to help them through those everyday issues?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So what do I do with those everyday issues?
Yeah, how do you work? How do you help people work through that? I mean, gosh, I need to be on my phone all day. I can't get any work done.
Yeah. So usually when it's an ongoing problem, that reaches the point of needing treatment, there's going to be pain there. So the short answer there is you deal with the pain. Now, you know, like I said, that's an art that's being lost in therapy. We've become a lot more manualized, and people are just told to go through this certain set of exercises and it'll go away. And it's just too much of a logical approach for most people. So, um, but yeah, so usually once someone reaches my office, we're going after the pain. As far as where a lot of other people are that don't reach the point of needing treatment, where you're just on your phone too much. I think a lot of it is being able to really communicate, with the people around you, what you're experiencing. So forget calling it addiction, forget naming it anything in particular, but just talking about it in regular terms. So, and we could go through this really with any example, but say, you know, you don't have any huge pain in life, but you're sitting at notice that like every time at dinner, you're looking down at your phone and not your partner. Um, simply just being able to talk about that and include in that the full context. So some of the things, and that's why I like doing this, is just educating people, being able to talk with a partner about like, geez, I can't seem to unglue this phone, and I keep looking at, being able to talk about that together, being able to talk about what's this doing to our relationship, what, and being able to discuss it in very regular terms so that it's not just like this boogeyman that takes you over. Because that we have no control or mastery over is when something is taking some control of us and we don't even see it happening, we don't recognize it, we don't know how it's working, we don't know how it's operating. That's boogeyman territory, right? We're afraid of ghosts because you can't punch them, you can't shoot them, you don't know when they're going to be there. That's when we get scared, that's when we don't have control. But when we know our enemy and we know it well, that's how we zero in, and we can actually defeat the enemy. In this case, it's our own mind. That's the messed up part. It's our own mind that's hurting us. Our own mind shooting dopamine into our system as we look down at this phone and look at the next feed and the next click and the next click. So, understanding the layers of how our mind is being manipulated, as you peel those back, you get to gain mastery. So understanding that there is clickbait, first of all, right? That makes you want to keep clicking. Understanding that shoots dopamine into your system. Understanding that when you do that, it's going to make that feel more rewarding and important than another conversation with someone that doesn't necessarily lead to this intense, immediate boost to your mood. Um, and so understanding all these layers and being able to talk about it, shame and guilt free. And when I say talk, it could be in your own mind too. We have conversations in our own heads all the time, of course. And often either we shame ourselves or other people shame us for, how, quit looking at the phone so much, or we shame ourselves, why can't I just exercise or do some, constructive reading instead of, I just got lost for 2 hours going down that rabbit hole. And that doesn't help. We need to always treat ourselves kindly or have other people treat us kindly and really understand how we're being controlled and work through that in the most non-judgmental fashion possible.
So this has been an absolutely incredible, educationally sound conversation. We got a lot of science. We talked about practical stuff. We talked about how this affects, how addictions affect our lives. Dr. Hochman, is there anything that you would also add to the end of the conversation that we can leave our viewers with?
Really just to cap off what we're saying and maybe just summarize that, which is, we all have an addiction circuit. We all love escaping the mundane or difficult parts of life, and that's really normal. And if you're suffering in any way, mild or severely, with a hard substance and you're losing your life or just using your phone too much, just being kind to yourself and understanding we all do this to some degree, and being able to just work through that and follow that pain so that there's less to escape. The less you have to escape, the easier it is to be healthy. It's very hard to be healthy when it's all uphill. If you put me through hard day after hard day, I'm going to break at some point.
Sure.
And that we can't treat ourselves so cruelly, expecting that anybody has got the discipline or intelligence or tolerance, for that much difficulty. And so that's the main message really I'd like to leave people with is be kind to yourself and work through it and try and remove that pain.
Thank you very much. I'd like to let everybody know Dr. Hochman has told me that anyone who comes to his services at selfrecovery.org through this telecast can receive a discount on the services by using a coupon code. Just type in Maiden, Maiden, and you will get a discount on those services, which I now think are probably excellent. So, Dr. Hochman, thank you so much for being an amazing guest. You've offered incredibly good information to our viewers, and I am sure that people who watch this later will really be satisfied with the information you've offered. And I look forward to having you back because there's so much here to unpack, and you've offered a really sound way to approach it. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time. This has been Women's Health Weekly with the experts from Maiden Lane Medical and their guests from across the country, where you get expert information without having to go out into the Google sphere. Thank you very much. Everybody be well, take good care of yourself, have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to seeing